Opening. The gift exchange humiliation. Christmas morning at my parents' house had always been a carefully orchestrated display of family hierarchy, but this year felt particularly brutal. I sat on the living room floor in my old spot from childhood, watching my cousins exchange expensive gifts while a single small package sat in front of me, a $20 gift card to Target from my Aunt Linda. "We didn't want to overwhelm Rachel with presents she can't reciprocate," Aunt Linda announced to the room, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It wouldn't be fair to make her feel bad about her situation." My situation. At 32, I was the family disappointment who'd never quite figured out how to be successful like everyone else. While my cousin Jake ran his father's expanding accounting firm and cousin Sarah managed 3 franchise restaurants, I worked as a freelance grant writer for nonprofits, a career choice that baffled and embarrassed my family. "Successful people give presents," Aunt Linda continued, gesturing toward the mountain of expensive gifts her children had brought for each other. "It's about showing you care enough to invest in your relationships." The implication was clear. My inability to buy lavish gifts reflected my general failure to thrive in life. Never mind that I'd deliberately chosen nonprofit work because I wanted to make a difference. Never mind that I'd helped secure millions in funding for organizations serving homeless families, veterans, and disaster victims. To my family, success was measured in luxury cars, designer handbags, and the ability to spend without checking your bank balance. My Honda Civic thrift store wardrobe and careful budgeting marked me as someone who'd never figured out how to win at life. "Rachel's always been more idealistic," Mom said with that particular tone of disappointed resignation she'd perfected over the years. "She chose a path that's meaningful to her, even if it's not financially rewarding." Uncle Bob nodded knowingly from his chair, where he was wearing a Rolex that Jake had given him for Christmas. "The nonprofit sector is admirable work, but it doesn't pay the bills. That's reality." What they didn't know was that my nonprofit work had evolved far beyond what they imagined. Over the past 3 years, I'd built a consulting firm that specialized in securing major philanthropic donations for charitable organizations. My client list included some of the largest foundations in the country, and my success rate for landing 7-figure donations was unprecedented in the industry. But I'd learned to keep quiet about my professional achievements. Every time I'd tried to share good news about a successful grant application or a major donation I'd secured, the conversation somehow shifted to Jake's business expansion or Sarah's restaurant profits, tangible successes they could understand and celebrate. The gift exchange continued around me like a performance I wasn't invited to join. Jake presented his wife with diamond earrings. Sarah's husband surprised her with a weekend getaway to Napa Valley. Even my teenage nephew had bought his girlfriend an expensive necklace. I watched it all from my corner of the room, holding my Target gift card and feeling like the charity case at a millionaire's Christmas party. "Maybe next year Rachel will be in a position to participate more fully," Aunt Linda said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Once she finds something more sustainable." The assumption that I needed to find something more sustainable stung, particularly given what I had planned for later that morning. But I'd grown accustomed to my family's inability to see past their narrow definition of success. "Speaking of next year," Uncle Bob said, "Jake's projected revenue growth should put the firm well into 8 figures. We're looking at expanding into 3 new states." And we were off to the races with another round of Jake appreciation. His innovative accounting strategies, his impressive client retention rate, his natural business instincts that reminded everyone of Uncle Bob's own entrepreneurial success. I excused myself to help with breakfast preparations, grateful for an escape from the gift-giving spectacle. In the kitchen, I checked my phone and saw a text from my assistant. "Media coordination confirmed for 11 a.m. Channel 7 and Channel 12 will be there. Foundation representative will arrive at 10:45. My heart rate picked up slightly. Today was the day I'd been planning for months. The culmination of a year-long project that would either validate my career choices or expose me to even more family ridicule. "Rachel, could you set the table?" Mom called from the dining room. "And maybe put your phone away? It's Christmas morning." I slipped my phone back into my pocket and began arranging place settings, listening to the ongoing conversation about business success and financial achievement from the living room. Soon they'd find out that their assumptions about my life had been spectacularly wrong. Build up. The morning's escalating condescension. Breakfast was a continuation of the gift exchange theme, with conversation dominated by discussions of expensive purchases, vacation plans, and business expansion strategies. I ate my eggs Benedict quietly while my family dissected the various ways they'd achieved financial success. The key is diversification, Uncle Bob explained, cutting into his prime rib like he was delivering a business school lecture. You can't put all your eggs in one basket. That's why Jake's expanding into tax consulting and financial planning services. Jake nodded enthusiastically. We're projecting a 40% revenue increase next year. The client base is growing faster than we can hire staff. That's the kind of forward thinking that separates successful entrepreneurs from. Uncle Bob paused, glancing in my direction. People who work for other people's causes. The dig was subtle but unmistakable. In Uncle Bob's worldview, working for others, even if those others were charitable organizations helping vulnerable populations, was inherently inferior to building your own business empire. Rachel's work is important, Sarah said, though her tone suggested she was fulfilling an obligation to defend me rather than expressing genuine conviction. Someone has to help the nonprofits, right? Of course, Aunt Linda agreed quickly. It's just that helping others doesn't pay the rent. At some point you have to think practically about your own future. I'd heard variations of this conversation for years. My family genuinely couldn't understand why someone would choose meaningful work over maximum financial gain. They saw my career in nonprofit consulting as extended volunteerism, admirable but ultimately impractical. What they didn't understand was that securing major philanthropic donations for charitable organizations had become an incredibly lucrative specialty. My consulting fees were based on the amounts I raised for clients, and my track record of landing multimillion-dollar donations had made me one of the most sought-after fundraising consultants in the country. But explaining this would require them to understand the nuances of philanthropic strategy, foundation relations, and major gift cultivation, concepts that didn't translate easily into their business-focused worldview. The important thing is that Rachel's happy with her choices, Mom said, though her voice carried the same tone she might use to console someone after a sports team loss. Happy with my choices. As if my career was a consolation prize rather than a deliberately strategic decision that had positioned me at the center of philanthropic circles worth hundreds of billions of dollars. My phone buzzed with another text from my assistant. Foundation president confirmed arrival at 10:30. Local news stations have been briefed. This is going to be incredible. I glanced at the clock on the kitchen wall. 9:47 a.m. In less than an hour, my family's understanding of my life was about to change dramatically. Rachel, you're being very quiet this morning, Aunt Linda observed. Are you feeling okay about everything? I know the holidays can be difficult when you're in transition. As if I were unemployed or recovering from some personal crisis rather than running a successful consulting firm. I'm fine, I said simply. Just enjoying listening to everyone's updates. Well, when you're ready to talk about next steps for your career, Uncle Bob has some thoughts about business opportunities, Mom offered. He knows people in various industries who might be able to help you find something more established. The hits just kept coming. Jake leaned forward with what he probably thought was helpful enthusiasm. Actually, we're looking for someone to handle client communications at the firm. It's not grant writing, but it would give you steady income and benefits. Something to build on. The offer was meant kindly, but it highlighted everything about how my family viewed my professional life. They saw me as someone who needed rescuing from my own poor choices, someone who required their intervention to achieve basic financial stability. I appreciate the thought, I said carefully, but I'm actually quite happy with my current work. Current work was an understatement. Over the past 18 months, I'd secured $847 million in charitable donations for my clients. My success rate for major gift solicitations was 94%, and my waiting list of potential clients stretched 8 months into the future. But trying to explain that would require them to reconceptualize everything they thought they knew about nonprofit fundraising, philanthropic strategy, and the economics of charitable giving. It was easier to let them maintain their assumptions for a few more minutes. The offer stands whenever you're ready, Jake said with the magnanimous air of someone extending charity to a struggling relative. At 10:15 I excused myself to use the bathroom, but actually stepped outside to call my assistant. Everything's on schedule, she reported. The foundation representatives are en route, and both news stations have crews standing by. Are you sure you want to do this at your family's house? I'm sure, I said. It's time they understood what I actually do for a living. As I walked back toward the house, I could hear the conversation continuing inside. More discussion of business strategies, market expansion, and the various ways my successful relatives had built their impressive financial empires. In 10 minutes, they were going to discover that I'd built something even more impressive than any of them had imagined. Revelation, the doorbell that changed everything. At exactly 10:30 a.m. the doorbell rang. I'll get it, I said quickly, but Uncle Bob was already rising from his chair. Probably someone delivering a package that got delayed, he said, walking toward the front door. Amazon drivers work on Christmas now. I followed him, my heart pounding as I saw the black town car in the driveway and the two news vans pulling up to the curb. This was it. The moment when months of planning would either vindicate my career choices or create the most awkward Christmas morning in family history. Uncle Bob opened the door to find a distinguished woman in her 60s wearing an elegant coat and carrying a leather portfolio. Behind her stood a man with a large ceremonial check and two news crews setting up cameras. Good morning, the woman said with professional warmth. I'm Dr. Patricia Williamson, president of the Williamson Foundation. I'm looking for Rachel Martinez. That's my niece, Uncle Bob stammered, clearly confused by the formal entourage on his doorstep. What's this about? We're here to present Ms. Martinez with our annual Philanthropic Excellence Award and a charitable donation inspired by her extraordinary work in nonprofit fundraising. The rest of my family had gathered behind Uncle Bob, their faces reflecting varying degrees of confusion and curiosity. I stepped forward, my professional composure intact despite my racing heartbeat. Dr. Williamson, thank you for coming, I said. I appreciate you accommodating the timing. Of course, Rachel. Your work this year has been simply unprecedented. We're honored to recognize your achievements. Dr. Williamson gestured to her colleague who stepped forward with the ceremonial check. The amount was printed in large, unmistakable numbers. $2 million. The Williamson Foundation is pleased to present this $2 million donation to the Children's Hospital Network, secured through the exceptional fundraising expertise of Rachel Martinez Consulting, Dr. Williamson announced, clearly accustomed to formal presentations. The silence from my family was deafening. This donation represents the largest single contribution in our foundation's 60-year history, Dr. Williamson continued. Ms. Martinez's innovative approach to major gift cultivation and her unprecedented success rate in philanthropic consulting have revolutionized how we think about charitable giving. One of the news reporters stepped forward. Dr. Williamson, can you tell us more about Ms. Martinez's impact on charitable fundraising? Certainly. Over the past 3 years, Rachel Martinez Consulting has secured over $847 million in charitable donations for various nonprofit organizations. Her success rate for major gift solicitations is the highest we've ever documented in the philanthropic sector. $847 million. The number hung in the air like a bomb. Ms. Martinez, the reporter continued, turning to me, can you tell us about your approach to nonprofit fundraising? I was acutely aware of my family standing behind me, their Christmas morning completely derailed by the revelation that their charity case relative was apparently some kind of fundraising superstar. Philanthropic consulting requires understanding both the strategic goals of charitable organizations and the giving priorities of major donors, I said, falling into the professional tone I used for media interviews. My role is to create alignment between foundation missions and donor interests, facilitating transformational gifts that create lasting impact. And this $2 million donation? The reporter pressed. This represents 6 months of relationship building with the Williamson Foundation, culminating in their largest charitable commitment to date. The funds will support pediatric cancer research and treatment programs at children's hospitals nationwide. Dr. Williamson stepped back into the conversation. We should note that Ms. Martinez's consulting fees for securing this donation amount to $400,000, reflecting industry standards for major gift fundraising at this level. $400,000. For 6 months of work. On a single project. I could hear Uncle Bob making a strangled sound behind me. Ms. Martinez, what's next for your consulting practice? The second reporter asked. We're currently working with 12 major foundations on gifts ranging from $5 million to $50 million, I replied. The demand for strategic philanthropic consulting has grown significantly as foundations seek to maximize the impact of their charitable giving. The interview continued for another 10 minutes, with Dr. Williamson providing additional details about my track record and the reporter asking questions about the philanthropic consulting industry. Throughout it all, my family stood frozen behind me, processing the fact that their struggling relative was being featured on Christmas morning news as a leader in a field they'd never heard of. Resolution: new understanding. After the news crews left and Dr. Williamson departed in her town car, my family and I returned to the living room in stunned silence. The ceremonial check, a $2 million donation I'd secured for children's hospitals, was propped against the mantelpiece like the world's most expensive Christmas decoration. "Rachel," Uncle Bob said finally, his voice small and uncertain, "what just happened?" "That was a client presentation," I said simply. Dr. Williamson's foundation commissioned me to develop a philanthropic strategy for pediatric healthcare. The $2 million donation was the result. "But you said you do grant writing for nonprofits," Aunt Linda protested weakly. I said I work with nonprofits. Grant writing was how I started, but my practice has evolved into strategic fundraising consulting for major charitable organizations. Jake was scrolling through his phone frantically. "Rachel, there are dozens of articles about you online. Forbes, Chronicle of Philanthropy, Wall Street Journal. You're listed as one of the top fundraising consultants in the country." "Fundraising consulting is a specialized field," I explained. "Most people aren't familiar with it because it operates primarily within philanthropic circles." "The reporter said you've raised $847 million, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "In 3 years." "That's correct. My clients include some of the largest foundations and most respected charitable organizations in the country. When they need to secure major gifts for capital campaigns or special initiatives, they hire consultants like me to facilitate those relationships." Mom was staring at the ceremonial check. "And they pay you $400,000 for securing a $2 million donation?" "Industry standard for major gift consulting is typically 15 to 20% of the donation amount, depending on the complexity and timeline of the project. The Williamson Foundation engagement was particularly challenging because they'd never made a gift of this magnitude." The room fell silent again as they processed this information. Everything they thought they knew about my career, my financial situation, and my life prospects had been completely overturned in the span of 30 minutes. "Rachel," Uncle Bob said slowly, "when you said you worked in nonprofits, we thought you meant you were struggling." "I know what you thought," I said. "Every time I tried to explain what I actually do, the conversation moved to someone else's business success. It became easier to let you assume what you wanted to assume." Aunt Linda was looking at her Target gift card with what might have been shame. "We gave you a $20 gift card because we thought you couldn't afford to reciprocate. You gave me a $20 gift card because you decided I was unsuccessful without bothering to understand what I actually do for a living." The truth hung in the air between us, uncomfortable but necessary. Jake set down his phone. "The Chronicle of Philanthropy article says you have an 8-month waiting list of potential clients. Organizations are competing to hire you. Philanthropic consulting is a very specialized skill set. There aren't many people who can successfully facilitate gifts at the level my clients require." "But why didn't you tell us?" Mom asked. "Why let us think you were struggling?" I considered the question carefully. "Because every time I tried to share professional successes, you found ways to minimize them or change the subject. Because you were so convinced that nonprofit work meant financial failure that you couldn't hear evidence to the contrary. Because it was easier to let you think what you wanted to think than to constantly fight for recognition." The local news was playing on the television in the background, and suddenly there I was, being interviewed about philanthropic strategy while standing in front of my family's house. The cheer-in read, "Local consultant secures record donation for children's hospitals." "That's our house," Jake said unnecessarily. "And that's our Rachel," Mom added, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty, as if she wasn't quite sure who our Rachel actually was anymore. Over the following hours, the dynamic of Christmas morning shifted completely. Relatives who'd been patronizing me about my career choices now wanted to understand philanthropic consulting. Uncle Bob, whose accounting clients included several nonprofit organizations, suddenly saw me as someone who could help his business rather than someone who needed his help. The expensive gifts that had seemed so important that morning paled in comparison to the realization that I'd built a career facilitating multimillion-dollar charitable donations. My Target gift card became a symbol of how completely they'd misunderstood my life and work. "I owe you an apology," Aunt Linda said as we cleaned up after dinner. "We made assumptions about your career, your financial situation, your life choices. We were wrong about everything." "You were wrong," I agreed. "But more than that, you were dismissive. You didn't just make incorrect assumptions, you actively refused to listen when I tried to correct them." 3 months later, Uncle Bob's accounting firm hired me to consult with their nonprofit clients on major gift strategies. Jake's business expanded to include philanthropic planning services. Sarah started a foundation to support restaurant industry workers, with me as their fundraising consultant. My family's newfound understanding of my work was gratifying, but it also highlighted how external validation had been required to force them to reconsider their assumptions. The work hadn't changed, only their perception of its value. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned that my worth wasn't dependent on their approval. The charitable organizations I'd helped, the donors I'd connected with causes they cared about, the millions of dollars that had flowed to critical social programs, that impact had always been there regardless of whether my family understood or appreciated it. Sometimes the most meaningful work happens quietly, behind the scenes, facilitating connections and creating opportunities for others to make a difference. And sometimes on Christmas morning, the world decides to take notice of what your family never bothered to see.